Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about efforts taken to combat non-response in a survey using multiple methods and multiple data sources. I'd like to thank my co-authors Renee Reeves, Beth Newman, Christine Bottini, and Josh Neufelder. We all know that we've been living in a world of declining response rates. It's been going on and well documented for years. And while we've tried to make attempts to curb this trend, most of the things that we've been able to try have had small impacts on response overall. This includes adding mixed modes, bringing in web, and updating contact materials typically have a very marginal effect on response overall. The survey I'm going to be talking about today is the National Survey of College Graduates. It's a repeated cross-sectional survey that's administered every 2 years. It consists of a new cohort and an old cohort. New cohort is sample members that are in for the first time, and the old cohort is made up of sample cases that have taken the survey before. The data collection cycle is 6 months. It consists of a web invite, and the non-respondents receive a paper questionnaire at week 8, and then telephone follow-up at week 12. The survey is sponsored by the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics within the National Science Foundation. I'd like to provide a little background on response rates in the National Survey of College Graduates. They've decreased a little bit over time, as you can see from this figure. However, in order to get them at the levels they are, it's required extending data collection and additional mailings. So specifically in 2019, to achieve the almost 68% response, not only was data collection extended, but there were 2 additional mailings sent and 1 additional email. Over the past few cycles, we've engaged in several research initiatives in an effort to maintain or increase response in the NSCG. So the first experiment we did was just a complete overhaul of the contact materials. And then the second focused on the use of deadlines within those contact materials. Then the next thing we looked at was the contact history instrument. We did a Paradata analysis there, looking at any opportunities to gain efficiencies in the telephone follow-up operation. And then finally, we did a web Paradata analysis in an attempt to reduce breakoffs, which thereby increased response. So the first experiment was a complete overhaul of the contact strategy. What we did was reduce the number of letters to start with. We did a post hoc analysis from the prior cycle and found, looking at the incremental response from each contact, that we could really space the letters out without harming response. At the same time, though, we revised the letters to increase the usability, include unique messaging in each letter. Originally, they were quite repetitive, so we tried to tailor messages to different audiences. And then we also increased the number of emails and changed the timing so they immediately followed the letter. So the idea was for the respondent to receive the letter and the email at about the same time, which would provide legitimacy for the email and make it easier to click through instead of having to type the URL in from a letter. And then finally, we also varied the type of envelope. Originally, all of the envelopes were white letter size. We wanted to try to find something that might stand out in the mail a little more, so we also incorporated a manila letter size envelope, a perforated envelope, and an odd oversized envelope that we thought would stick out. But here's a quick example of the revised letters. The original is on the left, the revised is on the right. You can see first that it's a little bit shorter. Also, you probably noticed the call-out box right away in the middle. This is kind of the ask. This is what we want them to do, and it really pops, and it's the main thing that people look at, as opposed to in the original letter, it's buried at the bottom. And then we also, below the call-out box, have 2 bullet points that call out how the data are used and why they are important. And this information is in the original letters, but it's buried in a paragraph, and it's much more general than it is in the new. So this figure shows the results of the experiment. We did not find any significant differences across treatment groups within each cohort. However, you can see from the blue bar that the new strategy did perform nominally better than the control group. Additionally, we found that there was no impact on data quality across 14 estimates and that this new strategy reduced costs by almost $8 a case. Some other interesting things that we found by looking at incremental response by mailing, that the larger non-standard size envelopes and the perforated envelopes performed particularly well. And we also found that the email directly following the mailing was more successful than that mailing alone or an email alone. The next experiment we did focused on deadlines. We added a deadline to the 2017 materials based on focus group responses, and research has shown that they can help overall response and lead to faster response. Unfortunately, we were unable to test variations of the deadline in 2017, and this was particularly important because the NSC data collection is 6 months long, so it really wasn't clear where we should place the deadline. If you put it at the beginning, does it lose its effect once you're a couple weeks in? Or if you put it later, can it have a benefit in making things seem more urgent? This table displays the experimental design. In the control group, weeks 1 and 2 had the deadline. So this was the deadline early in data collection, and then in week 12, we just asked them to respond today. Whereas in the treatment group, we asked them to respond within 2 weeks or respond today in the first 2 weeks of data collection, and then the actual deadline is placed later in week 12, where we asked them to respond by July 18th. We also varied the placement of the deadline. So within each, the control and the treatment, there is a variation where the deadline is either displayed just in the letter or in the letter and on the envelope. So here you can just see how the deadline is displayed on the envelope. Looking at the figure, we can see that focusing on the red bar, displaying the deadline later in data collection and on the envelope had a positive impact. The difference was actually significant for the old cohort and nominally higher for the new cohort. We also looked at time to respond in hopes of finding some cost savings, but we really see very little variation between the deadline placement or the deadline timing. Overall, we found the deadline at week 12 on the envelope yielded the same or better response rates, no difference in time to respond, and we did find some small impacts on key estimates, but they were largely driven by small cell sizes and weren't something that we were concerned about. The next thing that we looked at was the contact history instrument Paradata. So this provides a record of every call made to a sample case on its own row. So what the case is, the phone number used, the employee that contacted them, the date, some time zone information, and then the second to last column with the red arrow, the outcome, is what we're really interested in here. And this provides the result of the call. So ideally it's a completed interview, which is 001, and you don't see too many in the screenshot. But more than likely you get an answering machine or a number out of service or a ring no answer, things like that. And that's what we want to focus on here. So the reason that we're interested in these outcomes is that we noticed some runaway call attempts for different call outcomes. So for example, a fax machine was called 63 times at one point. So the chance of this fax machine ever becoming a productive call is very slim. So we thought that we might be able to impose limits on specific outcomes that are very unlikely to ever become productive calls, and then be able to use resources towards potentially productive ones. So the way we did this was a post hoc analysis using data from the 2017 cycle. First, we identified the most common call outcomes, and then we calculated the percent of CATI cases that would not have completed in 2017 under various cutoffs for each outcome. And then we selected a cutoff where the percent of lost cases was less than 0.05%. And the reason that we chose such a low cutoff is because we really don't want this to have any impact on response at all. The goal is just to identify cases that are never going to be productive, and then using those resources elsewhere. So we found that if this cutoff had been implemented, we would have only lost 229 cases, but saved over 27,000 calls. And then looking specifically at the outcome level, the lowest cutoff was 3, and this is for number not in service. And this makes sense of having a low cutoff because the chance of that number becoming in service during the data collection cycle is pretty slim. So cutting off at 3 number not in services, we only lost 13 completes. So only 13 cases had more than 3 numbers not in service, and ended up being a completed case. But we saved over 1,000 calls. On the other hand, the highest cutoff we had was 19. Makes sense that this would be a higher cutoff because it's a working number. But here we only lost 26 completes, but saved almost 4,000 calls. The last thing we looked at in our effort to combat non-response was web paradata. So here is an example of a web paradata file. You have a case ID, and then a timestamp, and basically after that you have every action or everything that the respondent did while in the web instrument. So you have a login, entry to a particular screen or page, if they hit next on the page, if they changed the field on that page, and then in the user agent at the very top you have information about their device, the browser they use, the operating system, and things like that. So the web paradata really just tell us about how respondents are interacting with the instrument and captures everything that they do. While there's different reasons to look at paradata, we're really going to focus on decreasing breakoffs here because it's most related to response rates. But you can also identify contributors to measurement error and find areas to reduce respondent burden by analyzing paradata. The first thing that we noticed was that there were really high breakoffs for smartphones. And this was largely because originally the screen was not optimized for mobile devices. So take the screenshot on the left. It's a satisfaction grid. Originally when this was displayed on mobile, it was shrunk down so you could see the entire thing on the mobile screen. So it was barely legible. In order to select any of the radio buttons, you had to zoom in. And then once you zoomed in, you couldn't actually see all the options that were available to you. So this was problematic on many screens that had more content on them. So we created a mobile-friendly design where for the grids, when they were displayed on mobile devices, it became a vertical column. So everything could be seen, there was no zooming, and it was much more user-friendly. We also saw high breakoff rates on transition screens, and this has been well documented in the literature. So transition screens are screens in which you provide the respondent with information, but there's no actual task for them to complete. So here's an example for the introduction screen, and then there was also an instruction screen following the introduction screen for the NSCG, explaining how to go through the instrument. So both the introduction screen and the instruction screen had very high breakoffs. So what we did was created a new login screen that had some of the information from the introduction screen, and then we included a link for instructions in case it was needed. We found that just by optimizing for mobile devices and eliminating the transition screens, we were able to drastically reduce breakoffs in both cohorts. So between 2015 and 2017, we saw a reduction of over 7% for the new cohort and 3% for the old cohort. In addition, we were also able to reduce completion times and have fewer backtracks in the instrument, just due to other changes we made from the paradata analysis. So overall, by updating our contact strategy through both the materials and the contact history instrument, we had the potential to modestly increase response, and we were successfully able to reduce burden and cost. And then looking at the web paradata, we were able to increase response by decreasing breakoffs, and then we were also able to reduce respondent burden by the other paradata analyses that we undertook that were unrelated to breakoffs. I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people from Census and NCSES for all their help putting these projects together and the data together over the past few years. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions.